My present point is that sky blue is found in nature with a definite implication in events, but is not an event itself. Accordingly, in addition to events, there are other factors in nature directly disclosed to us in sense awareness. The conception in thought of all the factors in nature as distinct entities with definite natural relations is what I have in another place, cf. Enquiry, called the diversification of nature. There is one general conclusion to be drawn from the foregoing discussion. It is that the first task of a philosophy of science should be some general classification of the entities disclosed to us in sense perception. Among the examples of entities in addition to events which we have used for the purpose of illustration are the buildings of Bedford College, Homer, and sky blue. Evidently these are very different sorts of things, and it is likely that statements which are made about one kind of entity will not be true about other kinds. If human thought proceeded with the orderly method which abstract logic would suggest to it, we might go further and say that a classification of natural entities should be the first step in science itself. Perhaps you will be inclined to reply that this classification has already been effected, and that science is concerned with the adventures of material entities in space and time. The history of the doctrine of matter has yet to be written. It is the history of the influence of Greek philosophy on science. That influence has issued in one long misconception of the metaphysical state of natural entities. The entity has been separated from the factor which is the terminus of sense awareness. It has become the substratum for that factor, and the factor has degraded into an attribute of the entity. In this way a distinction has been imported into nature which is in truth no distinction at all. A natural entity is merely a factor of fact, considered in itself. Its disconnection from the complex of fact is a mere abstraction. It is not the substratum of the factor, but the very factor itself as bared in thought. Thus what is a mere procedure of mind in the translation of sense awareness into discursive knowledge has been transmuted into a fundamental character of nature. In this way matter has emerged as being the metaphysical substratum of its properties, and the course of nature is interpreted as the history of matter. Plato and Aristotle found Greek thought preoccupied with the quest for the simple substances in terms of which the course of events could be expressed. We may formulate this state of mind in the question, what is nature made of? The answers which their genius gave to the question, and more particularly the concepts which underlay the terms in which they framed their answers, have determined the unquestioned presuppositions as to time, space, and matter which have reigned in science. In Plato the forms of thought are more fluid than in Aristotle, and therefore, as I venture to think, the more valuable. Their importance consists in the evidence they yield of cultivated thought about nature before it had been forced into a uniform mould by the long tradition of scientific philosophy. For example, in the Timaeus there is a presupposition, somewhat vaguely expressed, of a distinction between the general becoming of nature and the measurable time of nature. In a later lecture I have to distinguish between what I call the passage of nature and particular time systems which exhibit certain characteristics of that passage. I will not go so far as to claim Plato in direct support of this doctrine, but I do think that the sections of the Timaeus which deal with time become clearer if my distinction is admitted. This is, however, a digression. I am now concerned with the origin of the scientific doctrine of matter in Greek thought. In the Timaeus, Plato asserts that nature is made of fire and earth with air and water as intermediate between them, so that, as fire is to air, so air is to water, and as air is to water, so is water to earth. He also suggests a molecular hypothesis for these four elements. In this hypothesis, everything depends on the shape of the atoms. For earth it is cubical and for fire it is pyramidal. Today, physicists are again discussing the structure of the atom, and its shape is no slight factor in that structure. Plato's guesses read much more fantastically than does Aristotle's systematic analysis, but in some ways they are more valuable. The main outline of his ideas is comparable with that of modern science. It embodies concepts which any theory of natural philosophy must retain and in some sense must explain. Aristotle asked the fundamental question, what do we mean by substance? Here the reaction between his philosophy and his logic worked very unfortunately. In his logic, the fundamental type of affirmative proposition is the attribution of a predicate to a subject. Accordingly, amid the many current uses of the term substance which he analyses, he emphasizes its meaning as the ultimate substratum which is no longer predicated of anything else. The unquestioned acceptance of the Aristotelian logic has led to an ingrained tendency to postulate a substratum for whatever is disclosed in sense awareness, namely to look below what we are aware of for the substance in the sense of the concrete thing. This is the origin of the modern scientific concept of matter and of ether, namely they are the outcome of this insistent habit of postulation. Accordingly, ether has been invented by modern science as the substratum of the events which are spread through space and time beyond the reach of ordinary ponderable matter. Personally, I think that predication is a muddled notion confusing many different relations under a convenient, common form of speech. For example, I hold that the relation of green to a blade of grass is entirely different from the relation of green to the event which is the life history of that blade for some short period, and is different from the relation of the blade to that event. In a sense, I call the event the situation of the green, and in another sense it is the situation of the blade. Thus, in one sense, the blade is a character or property which can be predicated of the situation, and in another sense the green is a character or property of the same event which is also its situation. In this way, the predication of properties veils radically different relations between entities. Accordingly, substance, which is a correlative term to predication, shares in the ambiguity. If we are to look for substance anywhere, I should find it in events which are in some sense the ultimate substance of nature. Matter, in its modern scientific sense, is a return to the Ionian effort to find in space and time some stuff which composes nature. It has a more refined signification than the early guesses at earth and water by reason of a certain vague association with the Aristotelian idea of substance. Earth, water, air, fire, and matter, and finally ether, are related in direct succession so far as concerns their postulated characters of ultimate substrata of nature. They bear witness to the undying vitality of Greek philosophy in its search for the ultimate entities which are the factors of the fact disclosed in sense awareness. This search is the origin of science. The succession of ideas starting from the crude guesses of the early Ionian thinkers and ending in the 19th century ether reminds us that the specific doctrine of matter is really a hybrid through which philosophy passed on its way to the refined Aristotelian concept of substance, and to which science returned as it reacted against philosophic abstractions. Earth, fire, and water in the Ionic philosophy and the shaped elements in the Timaeus are comparable to the matter and ether of modern scientific doctrine. But substance represents the final philosophic concept of the substratum which underlies any attribute. Matter, in the scientific sense, is already in space and time. Thus matter represents the refusal to think away spatial and temporal characteristics, and to arrive at the bare concept of an individual entity. It is this refusal which